G'day everyone, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to be talking to you about caloric cycling in a contest prep. Do we see benefit in potentially eating more some days throughout the course of the week versus others, as opposed to just eating the same calories 7 days of the week in a contest prep when we're trying to minimize muscle loss and maximize fat loss? Find out what I think. Let's kick it off with establishing a goal. The goal of a contest prep, as far as I'm concerned, is pretty simple. It's twofold. First goal, retain as much muscle as possible. Second goal, lose as much fat as possible. Fairly simple. Now, to achieve this, there's two fundamental principles that you need to understand if you want to maximize muscle retention and maximize fat loss. Variable number one, understand energy balance. Get an idea about the calories you need to consume in order to elicit a fat loss phase by establishing a calorie deficit. Fundamental principle number two, progressive overload. Specifically, progressive overload of mechanical tension, or at worst case scenario, mechanical tension retention. At least retaining the ability to maintain the strength is the goal of a contest prep. If you want to do what we were talking about earlier, which is maintaining muscle mass, super important. So with that being said, we, as far as I'm concerned, have essentially three primary variables that we can manipulate in order to achieve this. Variable number one is energy input, and more specifically, macronutrient distribution. How do we distribute our protein, carbs, and our fats, as well as our calories throughout the course of the week in order to maximize the goal of contest prep? Variable number two, energy output. Things we need to consider: NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, or more basic, I suppose you could say, the type of, or the amount of activity, I should say, we do throughout the course of the day without thinking about it. And then the second variable to energy output, formal exercise in order to actually achieve calorie burning. And then variable number three comes back to our training and that progressive overload, and understanding the fluid relationship between managing volume, training volume, whether that be sets or tonnage, and also training intensity. How close to a 1 RM do we need to be in a contest prep in order to maximize muscle retention, or even potentially grow some muscle if we're talking about someone like an enhanced athlete? Now that we've established these variables that we need to consider, in this video, what I'm going to touch on is the potential use of a concept known as caloric cycling in a contest prep to maximize the goal. Reminder again, the goal here is maximizing fat loss, minimizing muscle loss. The focus of this video is primarily on variable number one, energy input. Now, also just start off by saying, for the purpose of this video, when I refer to caloric cycling, I'm largely going to be referring to the calorie distribution across the course of a calendar week of 7 days. So let's begin with defining caloric cycling. What is it? In the simplest sense, caloric cycling, as the name suggests, is simply just the manipulation of daily calorie intake, with the end goal still being a net deficit at the end of the week. This could mean that we spend some days eating at either caloric maintenance or a slight surplus, and other days in a severer deficit than what we would normally elicit in a 7-day standardized calorie restricted diet, but the net calorie consumption across the entire week is still the same. To make this even easier to understand, let's take a weekly 14,000 calorie diet, or more simply, a 2,000 calorie diet consumed over 7 days. Instead of simply just consuming 2,000 calories every day of the week, what an individual might want to do, or may want to consider, is consuming 3 calories for 2 days of the week, preferably consecutive, and then for the remainder 5 days of the week, they would need to consume 1,600 calories per day. In this particular example, the individual consuming either 2,000 calories per day, 7 days per week, or the individual consuming 2 days at 3,000 calories and 5 days at 1,600 calories, are still consuming the same net level of calories or total calories across the 7-day period. And theoretically, this would mean that they both lose the same amount of fat as well. So despite this intermittent shift in energy consumption, the energy output versus the energy input theoretically stays the same. So the real question is it necessary to cycle your calories if you want to maximize fat loss and minimize muscle loss? Well, first, let's talk about adaptive thermogenesis, or AT if I refer to it in shorthand. Adaptive thermogenesis simply refers to the unexpected downshift in metabolic rate that can't be accounted for the amount of weight lost in the individual. In short, what this means is that instead of you being able to eat X calories at X weight. What we actually tend to see in an individual who has lost weight is they can only consume X calories minus, say, 10% at X weight. In essence, while we may expect the individual to be able to consume, say, 2,000 calories at their new body weight, what we're actually seeing is they may only be able to consume 1,800, 1,900, maybe 1,950, but the point being less than what we'd expect to see in an individual who weighed 80 kilograms to begin with. That's assuming that the individual who's now 80 kilos was previously, say, 90 kilos versus a person who's been 80 kilos forever. Now, this probably sounds pretty dire, but in actual fact, it's not. It's normal. It is simply just another version of adaptation, and we have plenty of those in human biology. And just like any other adaptation that we're aware of, it's not static. Your metabolism is also not static, meaning it changes not just from day to day, but hour to hour, week to week, lifetime to lifetime. Now, the question may be, what does this have to do with caloric cycling? Well, this may not be popular opinion. It's kind of not relevant to caloric cycling, but rather it is generally the answer given for the perceived necessity to calorie cycle when individuals are trying to say, you need to do this in order to offset AT or adaptive thermogenesis. My personal opinion is caloric cycling isn't necessarily offsetting that like some people may make it out to be, but rather it's still a potentially really valuable tool to use if we consider just the end goal. So I just want to take a step back for a second here and recognize where this concept of caloric cycling has come from, also where some of the original information on adaptive thermogenesis was spoken about, and talk about an industry professional that anybody who's even somewhat educated would know about, and that is Lyle McDonald. So many years ago, Lyle McDonald wrote a whole bunch of books that are currently still available, hard copies, PDFs, doesn't matter, ebooks, on things such as flexible dieting, how to implement flexible dieting strategies, rapid fat loss books, stubborn fat loss protocols, you name it, he's written about it. Within some of these books, specifically the stubborn fat loss protocol and also the rapid fat loss protocols, Lyle referred to the intermittent energy restriction and intermittent energy intake that we now call caloric cycling quite readily throughout his books. Within these protocols, he proposed moments of extreme energy restriction, followed by moments of fairly extreme energy intake. Now, this approach, at least at the time, was thought to be potentially beneficial for offsetting the adaptive thermogenesis that we see in dieting protocols. More specifically, people like Lyle and similar were suggesting that these moments of energy restriction were causing a particular downplay in important metabolic hormones, and the intermittent energy surplus that was being achieved by those times of overfeeding was potentially offsetting some of this typical adaptation that we were seeing. Now, when I say we were seeing, I mean they were seeing, because I wasn't there, but you know what I mean. Now, Lyle has since suggested that this may not be the case based on the current literature that we look at, and that he may have been a little bit overexcited by some of the stuff that he was reading. Despite this, there's still actually a lot of positivity for the potential implementation of these strategies. It's just that the original strategies were centered around very short eating windows. In some of his protocols, they were hours based to 1 day, whereas now we may be suggesting that if we extend these protocols slightly longer, 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, maybe even 7 days and beyond, that perhaps we actually will see a positive shift in adaptive thermogenesis back to baseline, and that those effects may be retained for longer as well. But I digress. And I'll also get back to that in a minute. But first, I just want to talk about these particular hormones in case anybody at home is interested when listening to this video. In times of energy restriction, we see a downturn in a particular hormone known as leptin. It's a hormone that's secreted from fat cells. It messages back and forth to the brain, tells the brain whether or not it's essentially, for lack of a better term, I'll say happy or sad, in that if fat stores are full, leptin's happy, there's plenty of it. If those fat stores become diminished to a certain extent, then leptin signaling goes down, and the brain associates this with the need to then drive up other hormones such as ghrelin, which is a hunger hormone, cortisol, which is a stress hormone, in an effort to re-establish eating patterns that are sufficient enough to refill the fat stores that we're trying to actually remove. So the theory here, which is a cool one might add, is that in moments of energy restriction, when we see a decrease in energy output, specifically subconscious energy output, we see an increase in hedonic behavior, which is essentially reward-seeking behavior, going after things that taste good, smell good, typical behavior that we all know of when we're dieting and in an energy restriction phase. That if we can take moments of energy restriction relief, so to speak, that perhaps we might get like I said earlier, a resurgence of the hormones that we want to see and a downshift in the hormones that we don't want to see, resulting in better metabolic activity. So we're still burning through the same amount of calories that we normally would per minute or per unit of work, but also we're not suffering from the severe hunger and the severe reward-seeking behavior. But is this actually the case? In short, I'm going to say no, not really. While we do see a momentary shift in these hormones that we've just spoken about very briefly, might I add, it is exactly just that, an acute momentary shift. Currently, the literature suggests that the moment we go back into energy restriction, these hormones essentially go back into the typical adaptive thermogenesis that we see in normal dieting. So even though we see an acute positive shift, the long term essentially seems to be roughly the same in regards to the expectations we can have on adaptive thermogenesis in a dieting individual, regardless of whether or not they're doing 7 days of straight deficit dieting or 5 days low, 2 days high, 4 days low, 3 days high, 6 days low, 1 day high. More recent research though on longer intermittent periods of caloric restriction and calorie overfeeding actually is showing a lot more positivity in regards to maintaining a better metabolic system, and also maintaining more lean mass, and also maintaining more dietary adherence and increasing fat mass loss. Currently, the most recognized research in this is called the Matador study, which looked at 1 week on, 1 week off dieting phases in obese populations. While this isn't in athletes like the individuals who are likely watching this video, it still gives us some cool indications of the potential benefits of what we would refer to in the industry as a diet break, a period of, again, reaching energy maintenance in regards to the input of food that you're putting in for an extended period of time. In this instance, I would be saying 7 days to match that of the particular study. But back on task. If caloric cycling in its traditional sense, the 5 and 2, the 4 and 3 and so on, if that doesn't actually manipulate adaptive thermogenesis, is there really a point in doing it for a contest prep? In short, and this is obviously my opinion, I'm going to say yes. While it's anecdotal, it has been my experience at least that implementing intermittent energy restriction with refeeds, momentary diet breaks potentially throughout the course of a 16 to 24 week prep as well, that the results come the end of contest prep are far better than those times when I haven't implemented these strategies. And when I say the results are better in regards to the goals that I spoke about in the beginning of this video, which were to minimize muscle loss and maximize fat loss. More specifically, I see individuals have the capacity, or at least the ability, to withstand the dieting stress and manage to be able to reach a much lower body fat level with intermittent periods of energy restriction, as opposed to doing continuous energy restriction. Now, I personally put this down to 3 particular things, or 3 theories that I have in regards to why I think this is more successful. Number 1 is stress management. Number 2 is probably the most important, but compliance. And number 3 is for performance enhancement, or in some individuals at least, performance maintenance. Now, when you consider what those 3 particular factors are that I'm talking about there in stress management, performance enhancement, and compliance, they're all very conducive to, again, giving the athlete, in this particular instance, the opportunity to maximize muscle retention and to also maximize fat loss. And the cool thing is they all kind of intertwine. If we can manage stress, we generally get a better compliance. Compliance obviously always results in a better result. And performance is largely going to dictate the look of the physique, because performance is going to help mitigate the muscle loss aspect of a contest prep, which is realistically long-term starvation, and that is not conducive to muscle retention. So if we can employ dieting strategies that afford us the opportunity to still maintain performance while still pushing fat loss, for me, it's a no-brainer in regards to implementing something like caloric cycling. Also, I have a fourth bonus theory, and this theory is a little bit more shallow in its argument, but rather is a bit of a hunch that I have, and that is that it seems to me that at the back end of contest prep, when an individual is trying to get those last little bits of fat off, if we're looking at a guy and trying to essentially get him to that extremely straight glutes sort of point of view, that the 4 to 5 days of extreme caloric restriction followed by the 2 to 3 days of higher calorie intake seems to be necessary to work out that last bit of fat loss. It's been my experience that if we were to look at the individual from the beginning of this video, the 2,000 calories over 7 days versus 1,600 by 5 and then 3,000 by 2, that 1,600 calorie necessity to maintain the same net weekly deficit appears to at least pull off that extra fat. It's almost as if you need to go a little bit extreme to get the extreme, but we don't want to go a little bit extreme for extended periods of time because the risk of muscle loss then goes up exponentially. So the wonderful thing with this caloric cycling approach here is that we give ourselves the opportunity to use the extremities of dieting, going down to very low calories per kilogram, but only doing it intermittently, and then offsetting that stress with another intermittent phase of caloric over intake. Not a great term, but you know what I mean. And it's that approach, even though the net weekly calories are the same, seems to be extremely positive in regards to the results that it tends to achieve. So yeah, that's my experience, but my experience is that doing 2,000 calories over 7 days doesn't seem to elicit the same result at the back end of dieting as doing 1,600 by 5 and 2 by 3,000, at least not in trying to achieve that legitimate, very lean, fully striated glutes look. But anyway, delving into the nuances of that, I suppose, is probably a whole nother video. So instead, I think I'll wrap this up here and give you some take-home points. This is how I have in the past and do currently for some athletes. Mind you, this is not for all athletes because obviously it's an individualized approach here. This is how I implement caloric cycling from a contest prep start to finish. Weeks 1 to 4, we're going to go into heavy caloric restriction. No refeeds, definitely no diet breaks. You don't need a diet break that early in a dieting phase. And the goal here is to maximize fat loss as quick as possible in the least stressful moment of contest prep. At the beginning of contest prep, we have an abundance of fat, we have extremely high motivation, and the risk for muscle loss is fairly low. So this may be something like going into the sort of 25 times body weight for the boys range, 25 times body weight kilograms, that is, calories per kilogram body weight, and 20 for the girls. Pretty damn low calories, not so low that we're doing anything silly and they should still be able to perform, but low enough that we can drive up fat loss and still not worry about muscle loss just yet. I particularly like this approach of going quite hard in the beginning because motivation is high, like I said, so the individual is generally going to get stuck in and they're going to really nail the diet and they're going to go ham. The stress is low. The need to sort of eat other foods is low. They don't really have that hedonic drive yet, so this extreme restriction tends to be less stressful than what it would be at the later ends of phases of prep. So weeks 1 to 4, extremely harsh calorie deficit, get in, take off as much fat as we possibly can. And for those that are unaware, the cool thing about extreme caloric restriction is that fat loss can essentially go up linearly, I should say, with the level of restriction. So if we were talking about a 500 calorie deficit per day over the 7 days of the week, and that was roughly going to give us half a kilo of fat, if we take that up to 1,000 calorie deficit, we're still going to be looking at, theoretically then, 1 kilo of fat coming off. So it's a linear relationship, which is really cool. Now, that's weeks 1 to 4. Week 5, what do we do? Pump the brakes a little bit, pull off the stress, add in 1 to 2 refeeds. These refeeds, for those that are interested in trying to implement this, should be roughly back up to your caloric maintenance. Now, you should have those numbers from your pre-dieting phase, but if you don't, for whatever reason, in the vicinity of 35 to 40 times body weight for the boys, in the vicinity of 30 times body weight to maybe 32 and a half, maybe 35 for some instances for the girls. This is less about physical restoration of energy and more about just taking the brakes off the psychological stress of dieting pretty hard for 4 weeks. But I like this, so 2 refeeds, and also no need to offset the calories for the rest of the week because we've gone for a very harsh deficit to begin with. those 2 refeeds are still going to maintain a weekly net deficit. It's just not as severe as what it was before. Weeks 6 to 9. This for me is the get in front phase. So back into the harsh deficit, still no refeeds. You can still afford to really go quite harsh in this phase. So back to that 25 or 20 times body weight, no refeeds, get as much fat off as possible, get in front. It's better to be in front in a contest prep than it is to be behind. Also, the cool thing about this is that muscle loss is still low in regards to the risk here, so you can afford to really go quite hard. With weeks 6 to 9 done, we should be roughly 14 to 16 weeks out, depending on when you've started your contest prep, which means you're in week 10, and I like week 10 for a full diet break. Really push the brakes now, pull back on the stress. We're not going to gain fat back because we're only going to calorie maintenance, but just take a moment to sort of say, well done, if you did your job. This is assuming obviously that you follow the diet and you've got the appropriate amount of fat coming off in that first 9 weeks. This is a phase to essentially re-establish metabolic health, to re-establish glycogen status, pump those carbohydrates in, push for performance, maximize recovery, and get yourself ready for the next 14 odd weeks of dieting. For me, this phase should be at least 5 days, preferably 7 days. You can think of this as your reset phase, like I said. Reset the glycogen, reset the energy, reset the motivation. Now prepare for the fun part of contest prep. So now you're into week 11 and beyond. And at this stage, you should be roughly 13 to 15 weeks out. Now, you're probably looking for answers for what to do here, but I think this is really where the art of coaching comes in, and the individual approach really becomes extremely necessary. While it would be awesome to template this phase, it's just not possible. It's at this phase that I have some individuals doing 1 refeed a week, others doing 2. Some do none. It really is then up to the coach-client relationship, having an open discussion about the dieting approach, the pros and cons of calorie cycling versus not, and then deciding what approach and what protocol you want to follow moving forward. But I will say a couple of things. As the prep continues, the necessity for controlling stress increases. Similarly, as a coach, your focus now should be on maximizing compliance. And in conjunction with these 2 things, it is critically important that you find a dieting strategy that is going to maximize training performance. For me, in this phase, the 13 to 15 weeks out phase, I'd want to see at least 1 refeed per week. How you do this though really comes down to, again, preference and individuality. But in case you aren't aware, I just want to quickly clarify one thing. The fact that we're recommending, or at least I am in this instance, that you start your dieting phase on a severe calorie restricted diet. When you add these refeeds in, the requirement to equate weekly calories is no longer necessary. What I mean by this is because we've gone fairly severe in the calorie deficit, just to pick an arbitrary number, let's just say we're in a 30% calorie deficit. If you add in 1 refeed, it is not necessary for you to retain the same weekly calorie intake like we're talking about with the 2000 approach before, because instead of now being in a 30% deficit, you're going to be in a 27 or a 25% deficit. Now, as we go through the continuum of contest prep, the want to push harder in dieting generally goes up from coaches or clients. But what we should actually be looking to achieve is starting with a severe deficit when the risk for muscle loss is the lowest, and moving into a smaller deficit from a percentage point of view as we get closer to competition, so that that risk becomes less risky. This means that as you add in a single refeed or even a double refeed, even though you may be now consuming more calories across the course of the week, because the deficit you started on was so large, doesn't matter, because you're still in a deficit, it's just that the deficit severity is smaller. I'll tell you right now, if you try and maintain that 30% or 40% deficit for the entire prep, you will go backwards. Now, just to clarify, when I say backwards, probably likely because of compliance and performance issues, not necessarily because you can gain fat in a deficit. You can't. But the environment that you're setting up with that dieting strategy is just simply not conducive to maximizing those goals that I've referred to so many times now. You see, this is where I think it's really evident that coaching isn't just about science, and it isn't just about experience, but rather it's having the ability to marry these 2 together in a way that allows you to individualize the approach really well to your client, specifically to them and them only, so that you can maximize the result for every individual that you coach, or every coach that you've been coached by should be able to do that for you if you're a competitor or the like. This is about finding ways to integrate the science with the experience. And for me, I believe that caloric cycling is a fantastic strategy to utilize in individuals going through a contest prep who are trying to get as lean as they possibly can while maximizing as much muscle retention as they possibly can. And that wraps up today's video. I really do hope that you found this useful information in regards to contest prep and caloric cycling. If you enjoyed this content, be sure to give this video a like. And if you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe to our channel as well. And finally, for all other information on all things Flex Success, check out the description. In there, you're going to find links to our Facebook and Instagram, and you can also keep up to date with other cool stuff we have going on. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.